So let's wrap this up by looking at the third part of this essay, which is important because one might say that here is where Schulz's original contribution should be to the conception of death. But looking at the very last part of section 2, he introduced the idea of modern science and the rise and influence of modern science. He says the second step is certainly more significant against such ideological accomplishments brought forward by religion and speculative philosophy, those ideological accomplishments being the notion of supernatural, metaphysical notion of death, and the notion of the soul as surviving death and being immortal. Science asserts itself, and to be more precise, the exact sciences of nature. What counts as real becomes determined by their cognitive ideal. The world of nature, which can be mechanically, physiologically, and biologically investigated, is the true world. Which is to say that, you know, if the modern conception of reality that we share is more or less a version of the scientific notion of reality, of what is real, then we're all materialists. In the sense that what is real is what can be studied by science. Anything else is a kind of a fiction, an illusion, an error. From this approach, it is clear death is a natural occurrence of passing away. So, no more, no less. We have characterized this conception of natural death in the first part and would like now to try and develop a few thoughts that critically confront this conception and that at the same time assume that the age of metaphysics belongs to the past. Again, the notion that the metaphysical conception of death is kind of a way station, he says. It's an interlude in the human consciousness of death. You can't go back to it. That is, our notion of death is going to be very much framed by science and by the kind of beliefs about reality that go along with apparently natural science. We shouldn't try to go back and recover the metaphysical point of view. At the same time, he does believe that we can draw some certain things out and then we can question our own belief in natural death, whether it makes sense, whether it itself is not problematic to a high degree. I mean, there's something, you know, really problematic about Plato's arguments in the Phaedo about the immortality of the soul. I mean, in a certain sense, they're pathetic if they're taken at face value. Pathetic in the sense that we feel for the guy, and we feel Socrates pathetic because he's trying to prove something which is very important for the context. Man is about to die. But we have give very little credence to the outcomes of those arguments. We don't really, I guess, feel very much convinced that there's something like an immortal soul after reading the Phaedo. I don't know. But that Schulz seems to be saying there's just no going back to that attitude. It's no doubt, excuse me, sorry, it's no doubt going to appear to be somewhat naive, no matter what kind of genius Plato was, the very endeavor to prove the existence of the soul. You know, assuming that seriously is what Plato was up to in the Phaedo, maybe that wasn't. I mean, if we read it again, maybe we would see that, you know, Plato wasn't completely being straightforward there, and that's probably got to be somewhat true. But it's not the kind of thing that we do. Now, what does natural mean? Again, natural, there's natural in the sense that I described in the last talk, natural in the sense of can be studied by natural science, and that definitely seems to be the view here. And then there's natural in the sense, oh, it's just natural. Natural in the sense of, well, should be acceptable. That is part of what he thinks the modern view is, and he questions that, you know, I mean, because, of course, something can be natural in the sense that I accept that it is a part of nature, but it can be unnatural in the sense that I hate it. You know, it's unnatural. Pain is unnatural in a way. You know, dying is unnatural because it's something that doesn't come naturally to me. Something I don't want. You know. So I think one of the things he's suggesting, being in part 3, is that our insistence that death is natural may be covering up what he calls deep anxiety about death, which we should face. Not just because we believe that death is a natural and unavoidable part of being an organism doesn't mean that we don't have huge anxieties, terrors, frights about it. Definitely true. But what is the real, what's the real nitty-gritty here? What is the real essence of our difference from the metaphysical view? I think that comes back to the question of the soul. First thing he says is that he's not a materialist. Page 477, he makes it clear that he does think that there is a difference between the mental and the physical, and therefore a difference in a human being between that aspect of us which is purely physical, our bodies, apparently, and something like mind or spirit or something. But what is the thing that he doesn't believe, and he doesn't think that is very easy to believe anymore? What's not easy to believe is the notion that whatever that something else about the human being is, whether we call it mind, spirit, personality, which cannot be reduced to the physical, what we find almost impossible to believe is that that can have a separate existence from the body. That is, that that aspect of us can be somehow removed from the body and still be something. So he says on page 478, about the middle of the page, it is undeniable. Human beings can only think on the basis of an intact brain. This is a fact that is unalterable and which defeats every attempt to place human beings in a pure dimension of transcendental philosophy. That is, to place human beings, any aspect of ourselves, in any kind of transcendent place, so to speak. And transcendent means transcending nature. Now, whether that statement that I just quoted is Schulz trying to illustrate the contemporary belief in general or his own personal belief, I'm not quite sure, but I kind of think it's both. And then along the same lines, a little bit below that, he goes on to say, this content says that man can only exist as spirit by mediation of the brain. Any attempt to separate the spirit as an existing something from the body and to posit it as a substance for itself presents a paralogism. Completely incoherent and contradictory argument. So I think that he's saying right there, we realize our difference in the contrast with the metaphysical view, that the natural view of death is bound up with the natural view of human beings, and the natural human view of human beings, if we understand it, is a explicit rejection of the supernatural view of human beings, and that was the notion that there was something like a soul, mind, spirit, which not only was an aspect of the human being, but was a separable aspect, that is, a substance, a being, an independent thing unto itself. And it's either the rejection explicitly or the dying away of that thing that really defines our view of death. Now, the rest of the essay, he suggests that we can understand our natural view better if we go way back to ancient Israel and to the sort of pre-philosophical Greeks, to pick up some things from them, because his suggestion here, which is really fleshed out in very much detail, is that our modern natural view of death is similar to theirs in certain respects, more so than our view is similar to our nearer ancestors in the classical metaphysical tradition. Whether or not that's true, I don't know, but what comes out of it is this notion of transitoriness, which I think, if we look at this essay and we ask, what is Schulz's original contribution here, besides sort of reviewing a history of ideas and putting things in perspective for us, what is he in terms of original thinking? It's this notion of transitoriness, and that what we share with the real ancient Israel, Homeric, pre-Homeric Greece, what we really share with them is this notion of a transitoriness. That is, without a really well-developed notion of the afterlife, without a notion that there is a part of us that is eternal which survives the death of the body, what we are faced with in terms of our view of ourselves and of the world is overwhelmingly the view that everything is transitory, that is, nothing is permanent. So this affects how we view the dead, right? He says something very interesting, I think, on page 479. He says, one point can be mentioned, the survival of the dead in memory. This memory manifests itself not only in the realm of famous acts of the great as exceptional cases, it is a motive for the manifold forms and rites which the cult of the dead has produced. The dead are still present in remembrance as remembrance. It is probably no exaggeration to say that this remembrance is, for modern human beings, the only possibility in which they realize the idea of survival. I've heard that so many times in philosophy and death classes in the past, that people live on in our memories. And so it seems that Schulz is really onto something there. That is, our strongest notion of the survival of the dead is not that we imagine the dead survive in the form of their immortal souls, but rather the dead survive in the form of our memories of the dead. But there's something pathetic about this. He instantly points out this notion that people live on in memory. As he says, and yet it is precisely this memory of the dead which testifies to its transitoriness. And I'll just read the rest of it. It is evident that the fact of memory indicates the possibility of bodily transcendence, as Sheeler says. Although the corpse of the dead person is disintegrated, we still remember him. But the other side must also be mentioned. Remembrance presupposes the rememberers as rememberers. When they themselves are no longer, and the dead man is forgotten, then he is dead for good. Which is, something we all know, but is not often noted because it's kind of impolite. Say, well, he lives on in my memory. Well, how long are you going to live? And therefore, how long are the memories of the dead going to live? Really not very long. Really, blink of an eye in terms of history. So the ephemerality, the transitoriness of the world, of us, and death is an indication of the transitoriness. This shows up even in our notion of how the dead survive death, in our memories, which are as transitory as we are. So this notion of transitoriness is what really he thinks it needs to be noted in terms of our modern view of death, that the view of natural death, and the idea that death is the absolute end of the person, indicates an absolute, or a view of absolute transitoriness, that there's nothing in the world that is permanent. As he say, transitoriness befalls every human, indeed every living thing. It is an indication of entities in general, things in general. That's what he says on page 480. So this notion of transitoriness, of nothing being permanent, again, at the bottom of page 480, the idea of transitoriness delivers, so we think, even if it only existed in a modified form in the tradition, the determinative background for the normative conceptions and behavior in relation to death and dying that are beginning to emerge today. So we could understand Schulz is attempting to provide a philosophical grounding, or at least explicate the implicit philosophical framework for the earlier sort of discussions that he alluded to, the medical realm of talking about death, the sociological realm, and what do you call it, the psychological realm, the psychological realm, that what's in the background is a certain metaphysics, really, metaphysics of transitoriness, the recognition that there is nothing permanent about the human being, and that death is the absolute end. It's not a transition. It is the kind of brick wall that the existentialists talk about. One more talk, briefly. I'm sorry about some of the things he says in part 3, and then we'll wrap it up.